Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Hillel Israel Sector. I am a board member here at Street U Penn, and we are incredibly excited to have you all with us for tonight's lecture. As many of you may know, Street U Penn is Penn's political home for pro-Israel, pro-peace students. We are a chapter of a nationwide movement of campuses advocating and educating for vigorous and sustained American leadership in facilitating a negotiated two-state resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We are deeply committed to ensuring Israel's future as the democratic homeland of the Jewish people, which can only be secured through the creation of a Palestinian state by its side. We also are dedicated to creating space for meaningful, values-based, and honest conversation about Israel and a two-state solution within the American Jewish community. Here at Street U Penn, we strongly value our involvement in the greater Jewish community and are proud to be part of Penn Hillel Israel Sector. Tonight's event could not have happened without the support of a good many groups and individuals. I want to thank our co-sponsors for their support, including Penn Hillel, Hillel Education, Penn GPA, Penn Political Science Department, the Reformed Jewish Community at Penn, Dorman Diplomacy, POCO, and the Wharton Politics and Business Association. I also want to thank the Street Programming Committee for putting together the logistics of the event, and want to especially give a personal shout out to Claire Schönberg for all of her hard work in making tonight happen. We are so very excited that Peter Beinart with us this evening. Beinart is one of the most sought after thought leaders in the American Jewish community. Beinart is also a well-respected political commentator on issues pertaining to the Middle East and American foreign policy, and has been featured on CNN, ABC, NBC, and most importantly, the Colbert Report. Beinart is a contributing editor to the National Journal and The Atlantic, a columnist for Haaretz, an associate professor of journalism and political science at the City University of New York, and a senior fellow at the New America Foundation. In 2010, Beinart's informative and provocative piece in the New York Review of Books, The Failure of the American Jewish Establishment, followed by his 2012 book, The Crisis of Zionism, sent shockwaves through the Jewish community for their contention that Israeli policy, particularly concerning its presence in the West Bank, is leading to increasing estrangement between Israel and members of the American Jewish community, who find it difficult to reconcile their liberal values with a seemingly illiberal Zionism. Beinart's work unabashedly delves into the nature of the American Jewish community's relationship with Israel and the future of a Jewish and democratic state in the Middle East. Following the presentation, there will be a Q&A period moderated by our very own Rabbi Mike Uram, Director of Penn Hillel. Please use this as an opportunity for us to start a critical and honest conversation here in Hillel and in the broader campus community about the future of Zionism and the current relationship between American Jews and the State of Israel. And so, without further ado, Peter Beinart.
Thank you. It's really a great pleasure to be here. I know this is a controversial subject, the relationship between American Jews and Israel. After my book came out, a friend asked me, have there been any angry words, personal denunciation, ad hominem attacks? And I said, you mean outside of my own family? Yeah, there have been a few. My wife sent out an email at the time, as spouses sometimes do. She said, you can agree or disagree with Peter's argument, but we're very proud that he wrote a book. So she got an email back the next day. The person wrote, I would never buy that book. I think Peter's a threat to the Jewish people. I wouldn't give him a dime. So my wife forwarded on the email and said, who was that? They seemed so angry. I said, don't you remember? That's my cousin David. I haven't heard from him in years. My mother says it's a good thing that my grandmother doesn't know how to blog. Let me start by explaining why I believe that Israel's creation has been such a blessing for the Jewish people. First, it's been a blessing because we now have what we did not have in the 1940s, when our people were being led to the slaughter, a country whose mission statement is the protection of Jewish life. Some of you, being a lot younger than me, may take that for granted, but I don't. I still remember when I was about your age, watching a Jewish state send airplanes to pick up the Jews in Ethiopia, one of the poorest and most reviled communities on earth, and return them to be with the people from whom they had been estranged since the days when the temple stood. Second, Israel has been a blessing because thanks to the Zionist movement, we have a Jewish state as a cultural center for Jews around the world, based upon the revival of Hebrew as a living language. And with all the problems that we have maintaining diaspora Jewish life, one can only imagine how much harder they would be if we didn't have Israel and modern Hebrew to anchor us. But these inspiring accomplishments, I believe, are being put at risk by the Israeli settlement of the West Bank and the resulting threat to Israel's character as a democratic Jewish state. Democracy is not the whole of the Zionist dream. Israel is not, in my opinion, should not be a secular democracy like the United States. It should have, as I argue in my book, a special obligation to the Jewish people. But if democracy is not the entirety of the Zionist dream, it is necessary to the Zionist dream. Theodor Herzl understood this. His novel Unverwandt is largely about an election in an imagined Jewish state between one candidate whose party includes Arabs and supports the right of Arabs to vote, and another party that wants to restrict the right to vote to Jews alone. And in his novel, Herzl has one of the candidates who believes in democracy tell the people of this imagined Jewish state, quote, "You must hold fast to liberality, tolerance, and love of mankind. Only then is Zion truly Zion." Israel's founders understood this. In 1948, 3 years after the Holocaust, with the stench of Jewish death still hanging over Europe, and Israel in a war for its very survival against its Arab neighbor, and composed of an army significantly made up of people with tattoos on their arms, Israel's founders wrote a Declaration of Independence that promised complete equality of social and political rights, irrespective of race, religion, and sex. Unquote. For me, that democratic vision is crucial to the miracle that is the Jewish return to sovereignty in the land of Israel, and it's a big part of the reason an Israeli flag hangs in my 2 young children. But that miracle is today imperiled by Israel's control of the West Bank, where, in flagrant violation of the principles of Israel's Declaration of Independence, Jews carry identity cards with blue covers that give them citizenship, the right to vote, the right to due process, and the right to be waved through checkpoints. West Bank Palestinians, by contrast, carry identity cards with green or orange covers that deny them citizenship in any state, deny them the right to vote for the government of any state, and severely restrict their travel. Those cards place them under the jurisdiction of military courts, where evidence is largely secret, where people can be held for months or even years without trial, and where, according to a 2011 investigation by the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, more than 99% of those tried in 2010 were convicted. Between 2005 and 2010, according to the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem, 835 Palestinian minors, basically kids your age, were brought before military courts in the West Bank on charges of stone throwing. One was found innocent. This is not to say that Jews who live in the West Bank are bad people. They're not bad people. They're mostly people who moved to the West Bank because the Israeli government made it cheaper for them to live there. And it's not to say that Jews should not be able to live in the West Bank, a place where, according to Jewish tradition, our patriarchs and matriarchs are laid to rest. I believe Jews should be allowed to live in the West Bank, either as equal citizens in land annexed to Israel in a peace agreement, or as equal citizens in a Palestinian state. The problem is not that Jews live in the West Bank. It's that today the West Bank is a place where, contrary to the vision of Israel's founder, citizenship is ethnically based, where Jews and Palestinians live under a different law. And as David Ben-Gurion warned, if Israel makes permanent its occupation of the West Bank, it will be forced to choose between its Jewish and democratic character. It will invite Palestinians into a one-state struggle that Israel cannot win because its efforts to maintain itself as a non-democratic Jewish state will make it a pariah in the world. This is what former Israeli Prime Ministers Ehud Barak and Ehud Olmert meant when they both warned in the last 6 years of a potential apartheid future and a South Africa-style struggle for the character of the one state between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. It's what former Kadima leader Tzippi Livni meant when she warned recently that, quote, the existence of Israel as a democratic Jewish state is in mortal danger, unquote. I want to be very clear. I believe the Palestinians do bear part of the blame for the failure to achieve the two-state solution that would allow Israel to remain a democratic Jewish state. The Palestinians have undermined their cause through the terrorism that I call in my book grotesque. There is a troubling Palestinian tendency to deny the historic connection between the Jewish people and the land of Israel. And as I say in my book, there are real questions about whether Palestinian leaders will make the compromise, especially on the right of refugee return, necessary to bring a two-state solution to pass. But even if I conceded every nasty thing that anyone could possibly say about the Palestinians, it is not the Palestinians who are paying Israelis to move into the West Bank. It is this Israeli government that has reversed its predecessor and made much of the West Bank a national priority zone as eligible for special government subsidies. In 2012, a report in the business supplement of the Israeli newspaper Yediot Ahronot noted that the settlements received 70% more government money per person than do cities and towns inside Israel proper, and that the most heavily subsidized municipality in the state of Israel is the settlement in Hebron, which receives 7 times as much government money per person as does the large, poor city of Beersheba in the Negev. Last November, Israel's then finance minister boasted that during Benjamin Netanyahu's time as prime minister, the portion of Israel's budget going to the settlement had doubled. So it's not enough to say that Israel will get a handle on settlement growth when the Palestinians finally decide to live in peace in a two-state solution. Because by supporting settlement growth, you're pushing Palestinians in exactly the direction we don't want them to go. Every time Israel subsidizes more Israelis to move to the West Bank, we make those Palestinian leaders who will reluctantly, I underscore reluctantly, accept Israel's right to exist, and are today cooperating against terrorism, as Israel's own defense officials say Mahmoud Abbas is doing. We make them look like fools. And every time Israel makes it harder to build a viable Palestinian state, we make Hezbollah and Hamas stronger. We don't know whether Palestinians will ultimately make the concession, especially on the issue of refugees, necessary to allow a two-state solution to come to pass. But we can be darn sure they won't make those concessions if they won't even get a viable, contiguous Palestinian state in return. So even if you don't believe that a Palestinian state is possible tomorrow, you have, in my opinion, an obligation to try to stop the settlement subsidies that will soon foreclose the possibility of a Palestinian state, ever. A couple of years ago, one of Israel's foremost experts on the settlement, former Ariel Sharon advisor Talia Sasson, said this in an interview, quote, if you continue to build settlements in the West Bank, you are placing the destiny of Israel as the national homeland of the Jewish people in the hands of the Palestinian people. Because when you destroy the two-state solution, you give Israel's enemies the capacity to do politically what they have been unable to do, thank God, militarily, destroy Israel as a Jewish state. Zionism, at its core, is about giving Jews control over our own destiny. Settlement growth threatens the core of the Zionist dream because it takes that destiny out of Jewish hands. All of which, I think, raises a question for Jews here in the United States. In the face of this crisis of Israeli democracy, this crisis of Zionism, why is our community so silent? I'll give you the answer that American Jewish leaders offer, and then I'll suggest an answer of my own. The first answer that American Jewish leaders give is that it is not their place to criticize Israeli policy, since American Jews don't live in Israel, and thus don't bear the consequences of the policies we propose. Yet those same American Jewish leaders don't live among the Palestinians either, and yet they criticize Palestinian actions all the time. Nor do American Jewish leaders live in Europe, and yet they constantly criticize European governments, usually for their policies towards Israel. And American Jewish leaders didn't live in the former Soviet Union, Yet they moved heaven and earth when the Soviets were oppressing their Jewish population. And American Jewish leaders don't live in Syria or Iran, and yet they speak passionately about the crimes committed there. In truth, I think, American Jews have a very proud history of speaking out about things that happen in countries in which we do not live. So why exclude the foreign country, Israel, about which we care the most? Secondly, American Jewish organizations sometimes claim that they can't criticize Israeli settlement policy because a Palestinian state might imperil Israeli security. As it happens, that position puts them at odds with the vast majority of Israel's former top security officials, since every former head of the Mossad and Shin Bet, Israel's external and internal security services, who have publicly spoken in recent years, and every former head of the Israel Defense Forces except one, publicly favored the Palestinian state near the 1967 line. But even if you think those security officials are wrong, and that Israel needs to maintain military control of the West Bank for security reasons, that still doesn't justify paying Israeli civilians to move into the West Bank. After all, if the Arab countries were to invade Israel again, having remote civilian settlements scattered throughout the West Bank would be a security nightmare for the Israel Defense Forces. So even on their own terms, I think, the arguments that American Jewish organizations offer for their silence don't make much sense. The real answer, the real reason for the silence, I believe, goes deeper. It has to do with the way that American Jewish leaders see the Jewish condition. The only kind of threats to Israel that American Jewish leaders genuinely feel comfortable publicly discussing are threats from outside. For instance, the threat from global anti-Semitism or the threat from Iran. There are such threats, and they need to be combated. But I think the reason that American Jewish leaders feel comfortable publicly discussing only these external threats is because doing so fits into the familiar narrative of Jews as a weak, menaced, and reviled people. At the core of the American Jewish community's unwillingness to confront the internal threats to Israel's democratic character lies the American Jewish community's unwillingness to accept that although we still face external threats, that in fundamental ways, the Jewish condition has changed. The unwillingness to recognize that today, some of our deepest challenges stem not from our weakness, but from our power. Consider the way that American Jews discuss our holidays. I'm sure you're all familiar with the joke, every Jewish holiday has the same plot. They tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat. And there's a reason that American Jews laugh at that joke. It's because that's the way so often we tell the story of our holidays. So you ask many American Jews about Purim, now blessed memory, which is my daughter's favorite holiday, because it combines two of the things that she loves most in the world, pastries and dress up. And they'll say, oh sure, I know the story of Purim, sure. Haman tried to kill the Jews of Persia, but Esther and Mordecai saved them, and well then the story's over, and we eat our hamantashen, which are delicious. But that's not the way the book of Esther ends. It doesn't end with Jewish survival. It ends with King Ahasuerus giving Mordecai the right to take revenge upon Haman's people, and the Jews killing 75,000 souls. It ends, in other words, not with survival, but with power, with a troubling act of Jewish power, an act about which our tradition has a great deal to say, and yet we don't discuss that very much. Or consider the way that American Jews discuss Hanukkah, which is my son's favorite holiday, because it brings together two of the things that he loves most in the world, warfare and presents. Recently, we had a very difficult moment in my house because a rabbi at a school told my 8-year-old son that when Mashiach comes, there will be no more war. He was devastated. We were finally able to convince him that this was not imminent. About Hanukkah, we say, the Syrian groups wouldn't let us practice Judaism, but the Maccabees rose up and they defeated them and they dedicated the temple, and the oil lasted for 8 days, which was a miracle. And then, well, we get our latkes, which are delicious. But why do we stop there? The Maccabees became the Hasmonean dynasty, the last experiment in Jewish sovereignty before our own time. It was a very troubled experience. It's one of the reasons the rabbis of the Talmud didn't like Hanukkah very much, because they knew what the Hasmonean dynasty had become once Jews took power. But we don't talk about that, I think, for the same reason we don't talk about the internal threats to Israel's democratic future. Because we don't talk about the ethical responsibilities of Jewish power. And it is this failure to talk about Jewish power, to engage with what our tradition has to say about what comes after victimhood and survival, that helps explain why so many young American Jewish kids feel so alienated from our community's discussion of Israel. It's because those kids, more than their parents and grandparents, are growing up with power and privilege in the United States. And they're seeing Israel as a regional superpower in the Middle East. And so it is precisely what our tradition has to say about Jewish power that could be most relevant to them, if we ever talked about it. I think we need to tell kids like you that as a generation growing up in an age of unprecedented Jewish power, you have been tasked by Jewish history with a very special obligation. During our long night of powerlessness, Jews spun visions of dignity and justice that inspired the world. But only now, in this age, in your age, can we learn the true meaning of those ethical visions. Because the Jewish tradition of justice, forged in powerlessness, cannot survive the confrontation with Jewish power. If it cannot inform the actions of a Jewish state, then in retrospect, what good was it? This Jewish state is your birthright, your patrimony. It was won at a cost in blood and suffering that you could scarcely even imagine. And it was not born to be another Hasmonean dynasty. It was born to live the Enlightenment ideals that Europe had betrayed. If that kind of Jewish state dies, it will be a stain upon your lives. Israel's collapse as a democratic project will have as profound an impact on your experience as Jews as Israel's creation had for your parents and grandparents. In the 1960s, the best of your parents' generation could have been found in places like Alabama and Mississippi when American democracy was in its moment of crucible. And you need to find a way of being involved in the struggle for Israeli democracy, because although Israel may not be your country, the Jewish people are your people, and your fate is thus inextricably intertwined with the fate of that small nation half a world away. People sometimes ask me about the conversations I have with folks like my cousin David, who don't much like what I write about Israel. But in truth, those aren't the conversations I worry about. The conversations I worry about are the ones I'll have one day with my 8-year-old son and my 6-year-old daughter if we let the dream of a democratic Jewish state die on our watch. I don't want to have those conversations. I want Ezra and Naomi to one day put up the flag of a democratic Jewish state in their own children's room. By the time my kids are your age, certainly by the time that you college students are my age, we will know the answer. We will know whether Israel's control over millions of people who lack the basic rights that we would demand for ourselves. We will know whether that situation has become permanent. We will know whether Israel can survive as a democratic Jewish state. A great deal rests on what you do in the coming years. We're counting on it. Thank
you. Peter, thank you so much. Can you everyone hear with the microphone? Okay. So what the student leaders of J Street U Penn have asked me to do is to ask 1 or 2 questions to get us started, and then we're going to open it up to the floor. The format that we're going to use is to take 3 questions at a time and to let Peter respond in whatever way he chooses, hopefully politely. And what we ask is that this really be about questions tonight. So one of the things that we often struggle with when it comes to anything related to Israel is that questions become statements, that become paragraphs, that become manifestos. So there's certainly room for that, but tonight really I think just ask a question and let Peter respond. And by asking 3 at a time, hopefully we'll have a chance to kind of manage some of that stuff as well. So one of the questions I wanted to ask is the vision that you paint of creating a 2-state solution, of finding a way to solve the issue of how Israel treats the Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza is an existential necessity for the future of Israel. I'm wondering if you can dig down a little bit and talk about how you get from the current reality we're in to that reality. Because I think one one of the pushbacks that people maybe more on the political right would say is, that's all fine and good if you live in Candyland, but in the real world, there are real enemies and there are real complexities. So I'm wondering, on a practical and on a policy level, how do we get there?
Thanks. Look, the first thing I would say to someone who was more hawkish than myself, who believed that it would be too dangerous to create a Palestinian state today, would be to say, okay, let me concede for the sake of argument that it's too dangerous to create a Palestinian state today. You want to wait for the Palestinians to become more peace-loving and more willing to accept Israel's right to exist. I happen to think that occupying people without giving them basic rights is not a good way to engender that goodwill that you seek. But let's put that aside. Let's say that it's too dangerous now. At least can we not agree that to keep the possibility open one day, you have to stop paying people to move into settlements that make a viable Palestinian state impossible. And one of the things, there are many comforting fictions that the American Jewish community tells itself that make things seem easier than they are. One of them is that because most of the settlements are in these large settlement blocks, it doesn't really matter if Israel continues to subsidize people who move into the West Bank, because everybody knows, how many times have I heard this? Everybody knows that the large settlement block will simply be incorporated into Israel in a peace agreement. One of the settlements that's always referred to as one of the large consensus settlement blocks that's right near the Green Line is Israel's fourth largest settlement, the settlement of Ariel. Look at a map. It's not near the Green Line. It stretches almost halfway across the West Bank. The Palestinians have never accepted Ariel because it virtually cuts off the northern Palestinian cities of Solkarm and Qalqilia from the West Bank. Efrat, another consensus settlement, who hasn't spent a lovely Shabbat in Efrat, that people assume the Palestinians have never been willing to accept Efrat. It was not in the Geneva Agreement in 2003 because it sits right on the north-south artery that runs straight down the spine of the West Bank. Besides the fact that if you believe that Israel has to trade land inside the Green Line to keep some of these settlements, Israel does not have an infinite amount of land to trade. It was a fascinating piece by a demographer at Ben Gurion University a year ago, in which he said that if you want to trade more than 6%, you want to keep West Bank settlements that comprise more than 6% of the West Bank, and you want to trade. Remember, this is going to be equal amount, equal value land. If you want to do that, he said, you would have to move Jews off of their land inside the Green Line, so you would have good quality, unoccupied land to trade for settlement. So this is not cost-free. So I would say to that person, I will accept the idea, for the sake of argument, that the Palestinian state is not possible now. But let's agree to not make it impossible ever. The second thing I would say to that person is, I have not claimed, and I never will claim, that the settlements are the problem, that they are the core problem. There is another major problem. The other major problem is that Palestinians feel that Israel's creation, and most Arabs feel that Israel's creation in their midst was a historic travesty, one that they would love to undo if they could, right? But I think the important thing to understand is that there is a divide among Palestinians, and a divide amongst Arabs, and even a divide amongst Muslims. Not between people who love Israel and people who don't love Israel. It's a divide between people who can accept Israel's right to exist, not because they're happy about it, but because they know that they can't do very much about it. Because Israel has shown itself able to survive over decades and decades. And that they can come to terms with that, even if it's a tragedy for them, if the Palestinians have a state of their own, with the rights and dignity that goes with statehood. That's camp number one. Camp number two are the people who are willing to fight Israel for 100 or 1,000 years, no matter how many people die, in order to destroy the state of Israel. And so, it's extremely important that Israel act in such a way as to strengthen people in camp number one and weaken people in camp number two. And when you have a leader like Salam Fayyad and Mahmoud Abbas, who forswear violence and try to build a state without using violence to achieve their national goals, and you make them failures, and I would encourage all of you to read the interview that Salam Fayyad, who is by far the most popular Palestinian leader among Jews that had ever come along, look at what he said in his interview with with Roger Cohen when he stepped down. He said, Benjamin Netanyahu may be a failure. I said to the Palestinians, if we stop violence and cooperate with Israel and accept Israel's right to exist, we will be able to create a state. Instead, what he saw was that Israel ramped up settlement growth to unprecedented levels. And so Hamas and Hezbollah look at that and say, you fools? You fools? You think your way is going to succeed? I have to say, two of the most striking conversations I've had in the last year on this subject have both been with Palestinians, smart, well-educated Palestinians, both of whom told me with absolute sincerity that Israel is supports Hamas. And I said, you think Israel supports Hamas? How could you possibly say that? And they said, well, from where I sit, everything that Israel has done has benefited Hamas. You destroyed Salam Fayyad. You've totally discredited Mahmoud Abbas. And the only time we ever get anything from you is when we lob rockets at you. When we kidnapped Gilad Shalit, you gave 1,000 Palestinian prisoners back. When Hamas launched rockets in 2012, they got a renegotiation of the terms of how far the farmers could farm inside the Gaza Strip and how the amount of land that the sailors could go off the coast of Gaza. So they said, my friend Youssef said to me with a kind of twinkle in his eye, sadly, it seems to us that the only language you understand is force. And that seems to me a very, very dangerous message for Israel to send to Palestinians and Arabs. We have to make winners out of those people who are willing to accept Israel's right to exist and pursue their national project nonviolently. I'm afraid that this government in particular has been doing the opposite.
So the second question I want to ask is, one of the things I hear a lot from students is that there seems to be no space for civil dialogue or civil even reading material. That there's students say to me that there's an absence of facts. You can read an article that's written that is totally focused on saying that the IDF did nothing in 1948 that was problematic. It was the most ethical and peaceful military campaign in the history of the world. Or you can find an article that says it was a genocide against the Palestinians. It's very hard to find what actually happened. And the same thing's happening in terms of dialogue, where there's a lot of energy being poured into painting the left as dangerous and naive, and a lot of energy is painting the kind of right or the establishment as silencing thought or overly reactionary. So I'm wondering, to all the students in the room, where are places, and what both places to go where you can have civil dialogue, and where are the sources you can turn to that actually have information as opposed to just polemics?
That's a really good question. I guess the first thing I would say is I would really encourage all of you to go and listen to the speakers that you disagree with. Whoever is in this room, the person in this room who disagreed most profoundly with what I said, if you think you're that person, then then you are the person I am most grateful to see here. And you are the person to whom I give the biggest kohaka vote. Because the truth of the matter is, this is true amongst liberal Jews, hawkish Jews, and it's true amongst Palestinians too, that everyone goes to hear the people they already agree with. And that is just as much a problem for people on my side as it is for people to our right. And so I think the first thing I would say is, go to hear the people you disagree with. Even if they don't change your mind, you will probably come away with some greater sense of empathy for how they came to their set of beliefs. And at the very least, you will be better able to argue your own point of view, because you will better understand the arguments being made on the other side. One of the things that really frightens me when I look at young American Jews often, including especially kids who go to the kind of Jewish schools that my kids go to, is they are so insulated from Palestinian perspectives that they are completely unable even to really, I think, give a good accounting of the Zionist narrative, because they don't understand the alternative narrative. I think it's probably not realistic to expect you can find some text that is purely objective, especially on a topic like this. So I would say don't look for objectivity. Look for well-argued, factually based arguments on both sides. There are now actually a couple of dual narrative textbooks that have come out recently, where you have Israeli and Palestinian academics basically going through the history of the last 100 years. And literally, on one page is the Zionist narrative, on the other page, I know Shai Feldman at Brandeis has recently done one it's a three-sided one. It's an Egyptian academic, him, and then a Palestinian academic. And I think that's a great way of kind of reading throughout the whole history about seeing a different perspective. Or if not that, read a smart, sophisticated kind of argument for Zionism. I mean, a book that I like and was influenced by myself is a book by Amnon Rubinstein and Alexander Jacobson. The name, I think it's called Israel and the Nations, but it's basically a defense of the idea that a Jewish state can be a democracy, which is an idea that I've wrestled with myself a lot, and it's a sophisticated, liberal, kind of comparative argument about why that's possible. And then read something like Rashid Khaledi's book, The Iron Tape. Read a Palestinian writing about Palestinian history and Palestinian experience. And so I would say, try to get both sides, and then try to see where you feel like, what you find to be most convincing as you hear perspectives on both sides.
So you guys ready to ask questions? So just raise your hand and I'll come over with the mic. And actually, if you say your name also before you ask the question.
I'm Robert Brand. So recently, we were talking. He mentioned boycotts against Israel and the like, and I thought that it would be this great irony if BDS movements and the people who are fighting for a one-state solution, who are not interested actually in a two-state solution, were what propelled a peace agreement, a two-state solution actually forward. And you've talked a lot tonight about how we have to contribute to stopping the settlements, the increasing settlement project, and towards bringing forth a peace agreement. But it seems like J Street is not going to be considered certainly not a threat to Israel. And I wonder, what do you think we can do? And at what point do you maybe need a Zionist boycott or a Zionist sanctions in order to try to bring forth the solution?
Yeah, my name is Kelsey. I have a question regarding the formation of Jewish state. So there's been a lot of talk in the media and people development about the possibility of an Islamic state. And a lot of objections to that are that the contradiction between having is like what happens to the citizens who aren't Jewish, who aren't Muslim. But beyond that, I think the plurality that exists within Judaism and Islam, how do you kind of reconcile that? So I was curious, you mentioned you don't think that Israel should be secular, you think it should have a Jewish character, so I'm curious how you reconcile the two and what you think that would play out as.
Thanks so much for that. Really enjoyed the talk. I just wanted to hear a little bit more about your views on kind of boycott, divestment, sanctions, specifically how you think it would be implemented, and also kind of what role it would play in actually moving forward with policy.
Thanks. So let me answer the Jewish state question first, and then I'll answer the BDS-related question. One of the ironies about this idea of Jewish state is that it's a red line that's been drawn very clearly by Benjamin Netanyahu, by his demand that the Palestinians recognize Israel as a Jewish state. And also oftentimes you find in the American Jewish community that this is the line that divides those who can be in the tent and those who can't. Do you support the existence of a Jewish state? And it's always remarkable to me, given the vehemence that people demand that you subscribe to the idea of a Jewish state, how rarely anyone actually defines what Jewish state means. I mean, one of the reasons Israel has no constitution is that Israel has never been able to define what a Jewish state means. I think if Benjamin Netanyahu asked his cabinet to come up with a consensus definition of Jewish state, they would kill each other. Mahmoud Abbas could I propose that Mahmoud Abbas say to Benjamin Netanyahu when he demands that he recognize Israel as a Jewish state, get your cabinet to come back to me with an accepted definition of Jewish state, and then we'll talk. And he would get himself off the hook for a very long time. I'll tell you what it means for me. And for me, it's probably a more minimal definition than it is for some. For me, the only thing that I think Israel needs to have to be a Jewish state is some responsibility for the safety of Jews around the world. Which is to say that if God forbid, the government of Ukraine decides that they want to start oppressing their Jews, as the government of Ethiopia did. I want there to be a state in the world that sees that it has a special responsibility for Jewish life. And I think I'm willing to defend that being instantiated in a preferential immigration policy for Jews, and especially Jews in distress. And actually, as Rubenstein and Jacobson note, there are a lot of democracies, particularly in Europe, particularly in Central Eastern Europe, that have preferential immigration policies for members of an ethnic group. So for me, that's the one thing that I think Israel needs to have to be a Jewish state. I would be happy if Israel has a Jewish majority as well. But I find the idea of coercively trying to make Israel's percentage of Jews be higher than others to be repugnant. So I'm certainly not willing to do what Victor Lieberman suggests, which is to redraw the boundary so as to basically exile some of your own Arab citizens out of your country so as to change the demographic numbers, or to celebrate, as Benjamin Netanyahu did when he was finance minister, the fact that reduction in government childhood allowances had reduced the Arab-Israeli birth rate, and describe that as a success. To me, that's hideous. So I would prefer Israel have a Jewish majority. I would even be willing to go so far as to say that I would have no problem with Israel promoting Aliyah amongst Jews and making a special effort to convince Jews to come to Israel, but not coercive measures to maintain a certain demographic, position. And so that means that, although I have to say it fills me with some degree of ambivalence, if ultimately what it took to make Israel's 20% of its citizens who are Palestinians, I mean, we call them Arab Israelis, but they're really Palestinian citizens of Israel. If what it took to make them feel truly included was to change Nefesh Yehudi in Hatikvah from Jewish soul to Israeli soul, or to add another stanza to the national anthem, or to do something so that, because this is the terrible irony, right? So defenders of Israel will say with some pride, understandably, that Israel has an Arab Israeli on its Supreme Court, right? What they won't say is that person will not stand for the national anthem, right? Because he doesn't have a Nefesh Yehudi. It's not his fault, right? I love the Tikva, but if I were a Palestinian citizen of Israel, I don't think I would love it very much. So I'm willing to reconsider a lot, but I think it has to have a sense of mission of protection of Jewish life. On the question of BDS, you raised a really interesting question. I think BDS, the global boycott, divestment, sanction movement, which I oppose boycotting, divesting, and sanctioning all of Israel. I think it is probably going to grow. I think it's probably going to, it'll be stronger in Europe, but it will make inroads in the United States as well. I could see that there could be an argument that says that although the BDS movement is mostly one statist in character, not everyone who supports BDS is for one state, but I think the most powerful spokespeople for the BDS movement right now are one-staters. That paradoxically, it could so frighten the Israeli government, and maybe even the United States government, as to make a two-state solution more possible. It's conceivable. It's also conceivable that it could push Israelis further into a bunker and move them even further to the right. I don't want to take the chance, because although I respect the fact that BDS is a nonviolent movement, and I think it's important to remember that BDS does represent a conscious move towards nonviolence amongst Palestinians in the wake of the Second Intifada, I disagree with BDS because I think I want the tactics that I pursue to match up with the goals that I want. And I don't believe in the three stated goals of the BDS movement, the third of which is a full right of refugee return. I understand why Palestinians emotionally want the right of refugee return. But I don't think this conflict is likely to be best solved through through full refugee return. Not all, the conflict in the Balkans was not solved by all people who had to leave their homes in Bosnia or Serbia or Croatia going home. The conflict between India and Pakistan was not solved by everyone who had been born in India or in Pakistan being able to cross the border. I think in reality, Israel will have to make some kind of symbolic acknowledgement of what happened to the Palestinians in 1947, 1948, 1949, and allow some family reunification for people who are themselves originally refugees. But I disagree with the BDS movement's call for full refugee return. I also disagree with its call, by the way, for Israel to give back all of the land that it conquered in 1967. I'm not actually a great proponent of Israel giving back the Golan Heights. Certainly not under these conditions. So I disagree with some of the arguments, some of the planks of the BDS movement. The hardest part for me of writing my book, and perhaps the part in which I was least successful, was ultimately trying to say what I thought people should do, right? I mean, one thing I think people should do is I think that you young American Jews should go to the mainstream American Jewish organizations in your city or community and say to them, get a bunch of your friends together, show up and knock on the front door and say, we want to be involved. First of all, they'll be so shocked. You might give them a heart attack, right? Most American Jewish organizations are desperate for young people, right? If you come to them and say, you know what, we actually feel some responsibility for the perpetuation of institutional Jewish life in the United States, we want to be involved in your organization, but, you know, as it famously says, every generation hears the voice of Sinai anew, we also want to have a conversation about redefining the mission of your organization to make it more relevant to the realities that we see today. And in some circumstances, you can actually go, if it's the Anti-Defamation League or the American Jewish Committee, you can actually go back to the mission, the founding mission statements of these organizations, which actually talk about democracy and human rights, and say, we actually want to help you live up to your own mission, because we don't think you've been doing a very good job when it has to do with the West Bank. And you may be able to have a huge impact. So that's one thing. But the other thing that I felt like I needed to do was suggest some way that people could put pressure on the state of Israel. You know, Arthur Hertzberg is one of my great heroes. Near the end of his life, suggested that the U.S. condition military aid to Israel on Israeli settlement policy. I ultimately felt that I just couldn't propose that because I didn't want in any way condition American support for Israeli security. It just seemed to me that that should be separate. So what I ultimately ended up proposing was that American Jews buy products from Israel proper and not buy products from the settlement. And I was kind of inspired to do this by a letter that David Grossman and Amos Oz and Alfred Yehoshua wrote, in which they said they were not going to perform in the settlement of Ariel. To me, it's a way of affirming Israel's right to exist, but drawing a line between the part of Israel that tries to live in accordance with Israel's Declaration of Independence and the part of the kind of second Israel created in 1967 that represents a threat to Israel's existence because it so flagrantly violates the principles of that institution. To me, I think about it almost like, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the group Ur Tzedek. Ur Tzedek is an Orthodox social justice organization that's created a kind of a second hechsher. And they say basically, we think you should go to these kosher restaurants and use these kosher caterers because they treat their workers humanely and not go to these ones. That's the way I see it. It's essentially about saying, make a choice within Israel. Yes, buy products from Israel, but buy those products that are produced in Israel, in the part of Israel that accords with your values. It's been, I would say, an extremely unpopular proposal that I made that has probably made a lot of people think of me as perhaps in some ways more radical than I think I myself am. But I felt, especially if we're entering an era where the American-led peace process is not going to be dominant as it has been, and I think we probably are, I felt like I had to suggest something that people could do of their own.
I'm going to take 3 more questions from this side, and then we'll come over to you guys.
My question is on the Israeli pullout in the Gaza Strip, 405. It's often brought up kind of as a counter-argument from the right, as in seen as a mistake that Israel essentially gave in to Palestinian demands and they got nothing really out of it. Do you see that as a legitimate argument, and are there any lessons you take from that experience on how to go forward in the peace process?
This has been wonderful. Thank you. My name is Jonathan, and a few minutes ago you were answering a question that suggested that the Jewish state might indeed be able to simply focus on cultural and ethnic issues, such as getting persecuted Jews out of other countries like Russia and Ukraine and bringing them to Israel. You suggested that would be a sufficient way for the state to function as a sort of Jewish country. I do, and in doing so, ignoring the religious aspect. So I would like to put a little more pressure on you for a second and ask whether you think that the strong religious aspect of a somewhat orthodox government is strictly at odds with the concept of democracy. So not just whether the state can get by just focusing on cultural aspects of Judaism, but whether the emphasis on Jewish religion is posing an obstruction to the peace process and to other internal issues of Israeli governance.
Thank you. I'm Eric. I was wondering, you gave a number of suggestions about working on the issue from the Israeli side and kind of suggesting things to the Israeli government and things that we could do as American Jews, but are there things that we could do as American citizens that also have to deal with the Palestinian side and different suggestions like that? This way both sides can get into the table.
So let me answer the last question first. I think there's something very, very important you can do on the Palestinian side. One of the most interesting and conversations I've had since my book came out was with a friend of mine, a guy who's become a friend of mine named Fadi Karan, who lives in Ramallah. He went to Stanford. He went back to Ramallah. And he became at Stanford obsessed with the civil rights movement. And actually, he became particularly obsessed with the Jewish role in the civil rights movement. So when he moved back to Ramallah, he decided that they were going to do freedom rides. Basically, as you may know, it's very difficult to get from Ramallah to Jerusalem if you're Palestinian, especially if you're a younger Palestinian. Israel has quite severe restrictions on the ability of Palestinians in the West Bank to go to Jerusalem. So what he decided they would do in the spirit of the freedom ride was get on buses in Ramallah, buses that even though they haven't been issued the right cars by the Israeli Defense Forces, and try to take those buses to Jerusalem and then film themselves as they were being pulled off the bus. And he came to see me, I don't know how he got that for me, and he said, American Jews were so central to the civil rights movement that don't you think we could get some American Jewish kids to join us? The reason that doing that is so important is, first of all, you are making a statement that you believe in nonviolence and in nonviolent resistance. And secondly, you're also allowing Palestinians to see a different image of Jews. I think one of the most frightening things that's happened in this conflict is that as fewer and fewer Palestinians from the West Bank even go into Israel to work, and the Gaza Strip has been completely walled off, we have a whole generation of Palestinians who've grown up never knowing an Israeli who wasn't in uniform. Or in the case of Gaza Strip, the only image they have of Israelis are people in planes flying overhead. You can counteract that image, and you can do more to fight anti-Semitism than any kind of Israeli Hasbara could possibly do. I remember talking to a Palestinian woman from, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the protests that have been taking place in Nabi Saleh. Please, the next time that someone in the American Jewish community tells you that if only the Palestinians would take up nonviolence, that they would get a state tomorrow, tell them that in Nabi Saleh, they have been protesting every Friday for upwards of a decade now. And that they are met. Now, to be fair, there are kids in that village who throw stones, which is regrettable. I wish they would have. But the vast majority of people are nonviolent. They've been protesting the separation barrier, which has separated them from their lands, and they're met with tear gas and rubber bullets and imprisonment. But if you talk to the people from Nabi Saleh, the greatest revelation for them were the Israeli Jews and diaspora Jews who came to march with them. I talked to a woman from that town who said to me that when she went to Washington, she visited the Holocaust Museum. And I said, why did you visit the Holocaust Museum? And she said, I didn't do it for Benjamin Netanyahu. And I said, well, why did you visit the Holocaust Museum? And she said, I did it as an act of solidarity to honor the Israelis who come to march with us every Friday. You can create that kind of solidarity with Palestinians and fight anti-Semitism very, very effectively in that way, I think. On the question of the Gaza Strip, it's a really important question, and it's a question that you're right, has raised a great deal. For me, the lesson of the Gaza Strip is simple, is that unilateralism does not work. The problem with using Israel's pullout from the Gaza Strip as a template for what would happen if Israel signed a peace agreement with that created a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, as people often do in the American Jewish community, is very simple. There was no peace agreement in Gaza. The Palestinians would never have accepted a peace agreement in which they were given Gaza, but Israel doubled down, as Ariel Sharon did, in building settlements in the West Bank. Ariel Sharon, there are interesting debates about why Ariel Sharon ultimately decided to withdraw settlers from Gaza, but it was non-consensual. The Palestinians did not obligate themselves to anything in the Israeli pullout. If you want a model for Israel, an Israeli peace agreement with the Palestinians, you're much better off looking at Israel's peace agreements. Israel has signed 2, with Jordan and Egypt. Let you in on a little secret. There are a lot of people in Jordan and Egypt who don't like Israel very much. And yet those peace agreements have held now for decades. They even held a transition of power in Egypt in which the Islamist candidate who Israel feared most, Mohammed Morsi, won the election and didn't even withdraw Egypt's ambassador from Israel while Israel was shelling Gaza and being shelled back, of course. And it was the Egyptian Islamist government that negotiated the settlement to Israel, to the mini-war that Israel had in the end of 2005. Now, obviously, I don't know what's going to happen in the future in Gaza, in Egypt or in Jordan, but Israel's history with peace agreements, where in the eyes of the world, a leadership has to sign an agreement, actually has been pretty good. What I would say vis-a-vis Hamas and its role in signing in a peace agreement that was signed with Mahmoud Abbas is that Hamas does not need to accept as a political party Israel's right to exist. All Hamas needs to do is to publicly declare that they will accept the results of a referendum among Palestinians on a peace agreement. Hamas has to bind itself to respecting the will of the Palestinians. And in fact, Hamas leaders have said this. They've said that although they will never accept Israel's right to exist, they will be bound by the will of the Palestinians in a referendum. Now, there's a debate about where the referendum would take place. Would it include the refugee camps? It's a somewhat complicated question. But that's the principle that Hamas should be held to. And it's actually, there's an interesting precedent for this. Because you know what other major political party in this conflict has basically exactly that same position? Likud. The Likud party, the last time it came out with a platform, it didn't have a platform in these last elections, but the last time it did, was explicitly against the Palestinian state. So how does Benjamin Netanyahu get around this? He says, the party does not accept it, but we will respect the will of the Israelis as expressed in a referendum. That's the principle I think we need to hold Hamas to as well. On the question of religion, I would say that I think the creation of the chief rabbinate has been one of the worst innovations in Jewish history, and I would love to see it abolished. I don't see that you need to have, for Israel to be a Jewish state in the way that I define it. I can understand that Israel might have, its public holidays be Jewish holidays, just as in the United States, the public holidays are Christian holidays, or in New York City where you live, you actually even have a lot of Jewish holidays as public holidays. But I don't think you need to have a state religious body which is in control of marriage, divorce, burial, conversion, the thing that sends Israeli secular Jews scurrying to Cyprus to get married. I don't think you need any of that to be a Jewish state. And in fact, I think it would be a very, very healthy development because Israeli Filoni Jews are so alienated by the intertanglement of religion and state in Israel that if they were to be disassociated, they might actually take another look at Judaism itself.
Hey. Is this on? Yeah, my name's Soham. My question was about, so you talked a lot about the tension between Israeli Jews and American Jews. Being an individual who is neither of those things, I was wondering if you could comment on the potential release of Jonathan Pollard, who, it seems to me, strikes at exactly that tension between being an American citizen versus being a Jewish individual. And so should America basically need to release individuals convicted of espionage in order to facilitate that peace process?
I'm Talia Fishman, and as an American Jew of a certain age, something that disturbs me very greatly is the polarization within the American Jewish community along denominational lines. It is, I think, anecdotally evident to everybody here that within Orthodox synagogues, there is a far smaller tolerance for certain kind of discussion about Israel. And it's always struck me that these types of perspectives should have zero to do with one's level of observance or one's craving for spirituality. So my questions are twofold. Number one, can you explain what has happened in the years of my life that has changed this within the American Jewish community? And number two, do you see any way in which this type of polarization can be mitigated?
Hi, I'm Claire. My question is about, you talked about earlier how a lot of young Jews, or how the Jewish establishment as a whole isn't so receptive to some of the things that you said. So I guess my question is about Jewish education with the next generation. How do we create a system where we're able to be educated about the conflict in a Jewish way if these large organizations aren't really recognizing the narrative or acknowledging these problems?
Well, these are such good questions that, as you may have noticed, I'm not exactly always concise in my responses, so, but it's partly your fault. Actually, I'm interested, let me ask you a question to the audience, of the students here, the Jewish students here. Raise your hand if you spend at least part of your education in Jewish day school. Raise your hand if you didn't go to Jewish day school at all. Yeah, that's kind of what I suspected. So let me talk about the second and third questions. I think they're related. I think what happened is this. The people who, the baby boom generation and the generation older than those people, the people who are still, by and large, still kind of run the institutional American Jewish community, are what I would call secular tribalists. They are people for whom Zionism, and more broadly, a devotion to the Jewish people, basically was a substitute for religious observance. Right? And that, in their own lives, that worked quite well as a very powerful form of Jewish identity, forged at a time when Jewish life in America was more precarious, and where Israel's existence was much more precarious. So this became very clear to me when I introduced my book, Tom Dine. I don't know how many of you know who Tom Dine is. Tom Dine is really the guy who made AIPAC what it is today. He led AIPAC from 1981 to 1993. He's a very, very assimilated guy. Married to a non-Jewish woman, not that there's anything wrong with that, but just he's not exactly a guy who, davens midnight. So I asked him why he devoted his life to this. And he said, well, when I was growing up in Cincinnati in the late 1940s, I one day walked past the house of the Catholic family across the street, and their three boys invited me in to play, and then they beat me up and tied me up and beat me and called me Christ killer for 2 hours until an adult came. And I thought, listening to that story, I thought, if you told that story to a young American Jew today, it would be like talking about the Kishinev pogrom. It would be like a different world. And so that entirely explains his secular tribalism. But secular tribalism turns out not to be very transmittable to a younger generation under circumstances of radical acceptance. When the President of the United States not only wants to marry his daughter off to a Jewish guy, but a Jewish guy under a chuppah wearing a talit and a kippah, you know we're in uncharted waters, right? And so under those circumstances, basically what happens is the secularism remains and the tribalism collapses. And so I think that is the fundamental dilemma in terms of Jewish identity that everybody outside the Orthodox world is really wrestling with. And it has big implications for your relationship to Israel, because Israel is another Jewish thing. So if you don't have this strong connection to Jewish religion, Jewish observance, but you also don't have a strong sense of Jewish peoplehood, then Israel is just a country far away, speaking a language that you don't speak, which has a lot of problems that you don't really understand, and you don't feel very connected to it. And I think that's basically the reality for most non-Orthodox young American Jews. In fact, buried in the J Street poll of the 2012 exit poll was this fascinating nugget, that amongst American Jews under the age of 30, less than 60% could even identify who Benjamin Netanyahu was. In the Orthodox community, by contrast, you've had a community
that has managed to grow and grow in self-confidence and be very successful in replicating itself in the younger generation, especially as Orthodox Jews have essentially had the money and self-confidence to move out of the public school system. Remember, Joe Lieberman didn't go to Jewish day school, but Joe Lieberman was in public school his entire life, right? Joe Lieberman could not exist today, virtually, right? The Orthodox community moved into Jewish schools, started sending their kids on gap year programs after high school, and developed a stronger and stronger connection with the state of Israel. So that now, I think 80% of the Olim who come to the United States are Orthodox, whereas back in the 1970s, it was a much, much lower percentage of that. It's also, of course, ties in with a period of growing Orthodox self-confidence and assertiveness inside Israel itself. I'm talking about Dati, modern Orthodox, religious Zionist assertiveness. So you have now this very thick connection between Orthodox Jews in Israel and the United States. You know, many people are much more likely to have relatives, family members who live there. And not only a connection to Israel, but a connection generally to the Israeli right, since the Datim in Israel tend to be more on the Israeli right. So I think this is a part of what planning is about. The other thing that I think is important to recognize is that non-Orthodox American Jews basically vote against the Christian right. That's what brings them to the ballot box and keeps them in the Democratic Party. It is their cultural liberalism. For reasons that are interesting to understand, when it comes to issues having to do with sexuality, non-Orthodox American Jews are off the charts to the left. Gay rights and abortion. I don't think non-American Jews are quite as liberal to the left on economic issues anymore as some people might want to think, but it doesn't matter because they're voting against the Christian right every election on abortion and on gay rights in particular. And this has to do with the universalistic ethic that exists amongst non-Orthodox Jews, where it's really, really important to them whether there is gay rights for everyone and abortion for everyone. I think in the Orthodox community, by and large, the view is we don't care that much to be crass about it, about what, I say this is someone who's gone to my synagogue for most of my adult life and feels a great sense of affinity for it. But I think there's a generalized sense that what the Goyim do about their own practices is not really going to be a voting issue for us. And so it's not, I think, that Orthodox Jews are voting for the Republican Party because it's culturally conservative. It's just that issues like abortion and gay rights are not a factor. And so what that means is that you can vote on Israel, and Orthodox Jews are further to the right of Israel. And also, and I think this is very important, now I can't prove this, but I wish I could. I really believe that, especially in the Orthodox community, it is much more socially acceptable to say you're voting Republican because you think Barack Obama is bad in Israel than to say you're voting Republican because Barack Obama might raise your taxes. And so Israel is used as a convenient, this is not true amongst Orthodox Jews only, it's true amongst, politically conservative Jews in general, but I think Israel is used as a socially acceptable way of saying, of talking when it's not socially acceptable to just say, basically, you don't want to pay more taxes and have more money to be redistributed. What can you do about this? First of all, look, if non-Orthodox Jews make no effort at religious literacy, they're not going to be able to have an effective conversation in which they defend reform or conservative or any other or reconstructionist Judaism for Orthodox Jews when they don't even understand what their own denominational tradition is. Right? It's not like the first generation of Reformed Jews who grew up Orthodox and could explain in great detail why there was a basis for moving away from Jewish ritual law towards a focus on ethics. Right? So I think that to some degree, Reform and conservative Jews have to look in the mirror. I would love to see the creation of Reform day schools in which kids could become literate from a Reform perspective about the Reform movement's approach to Jewish texts and to Jewish tradition. But most Reform Jews don't send their kids to Jewish schools. On the Orthodox side, a lot of my hope resides in the movement that's called Open Orthodoxy. In my experience, a lot of the smartest and most interesting, especially younger Orthodox Jews in the United States are rebelling against the Orthodox movement's relationship to gender and sexuality, and especially the unwillingness to have an open dialogue, even about Jewish subjects, the kind of anti-intellectualism that exists in an organization, in a community that in many ways has turned against, Rabbi Soloveitchik's whole idea of Torah Umada, Torah and science, right? And so I think you see in open orthodoxy and the willingness to question, to ask difficult questions about the role of women, to re-examine sources, and to be willing to listen to outside perspectives, and to see truth and beauty in the outside world. I think you see a potential for a wing of orthodoxy that could be open to exploring sources and talking to people across divides when it comes to the Palestinian Israel. Although he's very, very far to the right in Israel, one of my heroes in American Jewry today is Avi Weiss. I think he is truly a great man. He's a courageous man, he's an empathetic man, and what he's doing in changing orthodoxy, I think, although he would probably be really annoyed at me for saying this, I think holds the seeds of an orthodoxy that is more willing to consider contrary views when it comes to Israel and Palestine as well. So, let me just say something really briefly about Pollard. Look, it's actually amazing, and it says something about American Jewish self-confidence, that the American Jewish organizations are willing to lobby for Pollard and not be worried about the claim of dual loyalty, right? For most of American Jewish history, American Jews would have been terrified. I mean, here's a guy, Pollard, who validates every anti-Semitic claim about Jews as people who have dual loyalty, and yet American Jews are actually willing to say, we're going to stand up for the guy to be released. I've never had very much sympathy for him. I've never had a lot of sympathy for Benjamin Netanyahu's desire to get him released from jail. But to be practical about it, he's probably going to get released next year anyway. I mean, his term does, he's eligible for parole next year anyway. So I guess I could see the argument that says that if you're really going to accomplish something in terms of getting Israel to make some kind of concessions in the peace process by letting Pollard out in 2014 as opposed to 2015, I guess I could understand that. The problem is, it seems like the only concession that John Kerry is likely to get is simply to get Israel to release the prisoners that Israel promised to release. I mean, I understand why Israelis don't like releasing prisoners who kill people. I mean, I certainly understand that. I wish Israel had done a settlement freeze rather than releasing prisoners. But if all you're getting Israel to do is to agree to release the tranche of prisoners that they agreed to at the beginning of this process, you're not really accomplishing that much. I'd rather save Pollard, maybe, for the end of negotiations when you can actually get something more significant out of it.
So everyone, I want to thank Peter Beinart for speaking. I want to turn it back to the J Street U Penn leaders to Akiva to close the program.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Professor Beinart, and so much, Rabbi Mike, for making this event possible. And thanks to all of our sponsors and for everyone for coming. I think this has been a great success. And one thing that I do want to say is that if you in any way have been moved by Peter Beinart's talking about the future of the state of Israel, then I really, really encourage you to go to the back and sign up for our message to John Kerry from American Jews to encourage him to really facilitate the peace process between Israelis and Palestinians, because as you might or might not know, it's in very great jeopardy right now, and we really need a coalition of people to stand behind Kerry in this time of need. So with that, thank you very much for coming, and good night.